Welcome back to part 2 of this history of 1920s movie studios, where I'll cover their unique individual characteristics, how they fit into the industry, their big movies, and any other interesting things I thought were worth talking about. Just like in part 1, the studios covered in this video are in no particular order, but I felt like I had to pair 2 of them up for reasons that will become apparent very soon. But anyway, let's get into it. Warner Brothers Studios was founded by who else? The Warner Brothers. Harry, Abe, Sam, and Jack. Their first 2 movies were released in 1918, both of them about World War I. Its number of productions remained low until 1923, making only 11 movies between 1920 and 1922. Warner Brothers became incorporated in 1923, which accounts for the uptick in production, as they put more resources toward making more of their own movies. The studio's biggest early success is a name that's probably familiar to many people, Rin Tin Tin. Of course, he wasn't a person, but a dog. And animal actors were pretty big news in the early 1920s, sometimes making salaries comparable to big movie stars. Rin Tin Tin had starred in 2 previous movies with smaller studios, but the third movie, Where the North Begins, was made by Warner Brothers, and it grossed more than 6 times what its modest budget had been. The canine star had other modest hits, always remaining consistently reliable for a decent profit, though nothing explosive. These movies were cheap and easy to make, with a formula that just kept bringing profit, so they kept making them. He continued making movies with Warner Brothers through to the end of the decade and beyond, usually starring in 3 or 4 movies every year. Warner Brothers also found success in the early 1920s with Wesley Berry, one of the biggest child stars of the decade. His movies, School Days, Rags to Riches, Heroes of the Street, and The Country Kid all made good profits for the studio. It also made a number of notable adaptations of famous 1920s novels like Main Street, The Beautiful and Damned, and Babbitt. In the mid-1920s, Warner Brothers acquired some important people. The director Ernst Lubitsch made his first movie with the studio in 1924, which was The Marriage Circle. By that point, Lubitsch was already an established director and a critical success. He made 5 movies with Warner Brothers, including Kiss Me Again, Lady Windermere's Fan, and So This Is Paris. The problem was that he wasn't profitable enough to justify his production expenses, so he and Warner Brothers decided to part ways in 1926. Warner Brothers also got a hold of the famous stage and screen actor John Barrymore. Barrymore provided a steady stream of hits, starting with Beau Brummel in 1924, then The Sea Beast and Don Juan in 1926, and When a Man Loves in 1927. Unlike Lubitsch, Barrymore was pretty profitable, but after a while he didn't renew his contract with Warner Brothers, and left for United Artists in 1927. Up until 1926, Warner Brothers was not a studio that anyone thought would upset the industry. It made mostly middle-budget, non-prestige movies that were decent entertainment, but ones that probably wouldn't last through the ages. But Warner Brothers would change the movie industry, forever. What distinguishes Warner Brothers from most other studios in the 1920s, and what it's now mostly known for in this period, is that it was instrumental in pushing for talkies. Sam Warner especially believed that sound film was the future, and that Warner Brothers should capitalize on them before other studios did. Although it was a big investment, Warner Brothers really became a big player in the movie industry once it dominated early sound films and talkies. Before The Jazz Singer in 1927, Warner Brothers had already released 12 movies that featured synchronized music and/or sound effects. But The Jazz Singer featured synchronized singing, and even a little bit of synchronized dialogue, and it set the stage for the talkie revolution in Hollywood. This made Warner Brothers an important trendsetter. In a case of cruel fate, Sam Warner, who had been pivotal in pushing for sound, died the day before the jazz singer premiered, robbing him of seeing the culmination of his vision. Lee DeForest, with his phonofilm, had created synchronized sound shorts as early as 1923, and had spread his idea to Hollywood, where it was implemented experimentally by Paramount. But Warner Brothers proved that it was possible to make talkies a practical reality in Hollywood. Its process for sound was Vitaphone, which recorded synchronized sound onto a large type of phonograph disc, which then had to be played separately but simultaneously with the movie. This was different from phonofilm, which recorded sound more conveniently onto the film itself. Vitaphone's biggest competitor was Fox's Movietone system, which was also a sound-on-film process. But Warner Brothers absolutely dominated the sound market in the industry. In 1927, it made more than 80% of all sound films, and also made most of the part talkies in 1928. And just as important as the first sound features and talkies were the Vitaphone shorts it made starting in 1926, which featured famous musicians and performers. By the end of 1928, nearly all of the major studios began to gradually abandon silent film production in favor of movies with sound, but Warner Brothers was already far ahead of the others. Vitaphone's sound-on-disc process became increasingly more impractical compared to the sound-on-film process that most of the other big studios ended up using. But for the time being, Warner Brothers hit it big in 1928 and 1929 with musicals. In 1928, the studio had the top-grossing movie of the year with the part talkie The Singing Fool, which was pretty much a direct follow-up to The Jazz Singer, with both featuring Al Jolson as the star. The Jazz Singer gets all the attention, but The Singing Fool is perhaps an even bigger turning point, since it grossed twice as much at the box office, clinching the dominance of talkies. Warner Brothers also made yet another major milestone in the industry. Lights of New York in 1928 was the first all-talking movie, meaning that all of the dialogue was synchronized throughout the whole film. But it was rushed out as a novelty, and the quality suffered significantly. Warner Brothers' second all-talking movie was The Terror, which became the first horror talkie. And with the release of those first two full talkies, not a single other studio had yet released their own. After other studios began releasing all-talking musicals, Warner Brothers was also on top of this trend, which showed off sound in a great spectacle. It released The Gold Diggers of Broadway in 1929, and that same year, another of its musicals, On With the Show, became the first all-color talkie. Along with yet another musical, The Desert Song, these were among the top-grossing movies of the highly competitive year of 1929. Because of its investment in sound, Warner Brothers went from a second-tier studio to a top-tier one, leading the charge in the talkie revolution. And it used its large boost in capital to buy up theaters to beef up its exhibition wing. It had already bought the large Piccadilly Theater in Manhattan in 1925 and renamed it Warner's Theater. Then, with all of its money from sound films, it quickly racked up some big acquisitions in 1928, including the Stanley and Scoras theater chains. Then, as was becoming common at the time, it started buying other studios, purchasing a majority share in First National Pictures. In November 1929, Warner Brothers would buy up William Fox's minority shares in First National to get full control. So that was the crazy story of the rise of Warner Brothers from Rin Tin Tin to Vitaphone. But there was another studio who went all in on sound, and had a similar rise as Warner Brothers, and that's who we're gonna talk about next. The Fox Film Corporation was founded by William Fox in 1915. It first found success making films with Theda Bara, the quintessential vamp actress of the period. Among Fox's early 1920s hits was Over the Hill to the Poorhouse in 1920, which made a very good return on investment. It cost $250,000 for its production and marketing, but it made $2.5 million at the box office. Perhaps Fox's most profitable actor was Tom Mix, the flashy cowboy star. While you would probably be hard-pressed to name one of Mix's movies from the 1920s, he was a big star, and by 1920, Fox was paying him $4,000 a week. One director working for Fox in the 1920s was the not-yet legendary John Ford. Ford directed a bunch of movies, mostly 5 reel westerns, which were quite short for features, often clocking in around 50 minutes or so. Though he also made non-westerns and movies that ran longer as well. In the early 1920s, Fox upped its production of comedy shorts, featuring names such as Al St. John, Hank Mann, Chester Conklin, Lloyd Hamilton, Max Swain, Jack Cooper, Slim Somerville, and Clyde Cook. Fox didn't have as many stars as some of the other studios in the first half of the 1920s, aside from Tom Mix, with Shirley Mason and George O'Brien being its more popular ones, though this would change in the second half of the decade. Fox had a few more big hits in the mid-1920s, like The Iron Horse in 1924, East Lynne in 1925, and What Price Glory in 1926. The Iron Horse, directed by John Ford, was a bit of an anomaly at this time in his career, running over 2 hours. It was made as a response to the massive success of Paramount's epic 1923 western, The Covered Wagon. While it didn't do as well as that movie, it still did very well, grossing over $2 million. Another important film for Ford was Three Bad Men in 1926, and Four Sons got a pretty good amount of attention in 1928. But Ford would have to wait a bit longer before he reached the highest echelons of respect in the industry. He actually stopped doing westerns for a while after Three Bad Men, not returning to the genre until his masterpiece, Stagecoach, over a decade later. In the mid-1920s, Fox announced that it wouldn't produce any more movies in New York, and would switch over to Hollywood completely, like many others were doing. In 1926, the studio opened a new 100-acre location studio called Fox Hills on the edge of Beverly Hills that would serve as a place to shoot outdoor scenes. This made sense considering how many westerns it made. Fox also began acquiring some promising new faces like Janet Gaynor and Olive Borden, and took on the directors Victor Schertzinger and Frank Borzage. Like Warner Brothers, Fox put a lot of resources into developing sound films, and it's mostly known for this in its 1920s history. But Fox's process was different from Warner Brothers. I mentioned it before, but just to recap, Warner Brothers used Vitaphone, which was a sound-on-disc process, and recorded the movie's sound onto a disc that had to be played simultaneously with the film. But Fox had Movietone, which was a sound-on-film process, where the sound was recorded onto a thin strip along the film. This was a more practical method because the synchronization was built in. Movietone was developed by Theodore Case, who had been instrumental in making Lee DeForest's Phonofilm. Case left DeForest after he got fed up with him taking too much of the credit for himself. Fox put out sound films shortly after Warner Brothers that featured synchronized music and/or sound effects, though not nearly as many. Less than a year after Warner Brothers released Don Juan, Fox had a big Movietone hit with Seventh Heaven in 1927. And its big prestige film that same year was also a Movietone film, F.W. Murnau's Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans, which wasn't super profitable, but won some awards for Fox at the first Academy Awards in 1929. It released another Murnau prestige film, Four Devils, in 1928, which is unfortunately a lost film. And like pretty much everyone else in 1929, Fox also got involved with talkie musicals, with the Fox Movietone Follies of 1929 and Sunny Side Up. Movietone was proving so successful that Fox changed the name of Fox Hills to Movietone City. William Fox himself started focusing more on the exhibition side of the business, and in March 1927, he was able to acquire the crown jewel of movie palaces, the brand new Roxy Theater in New York City. Then William Fox went on a theater-buying spree. He acquired more than 230 theaters in the West Coast Theaters chain. Then in September 1928, he also acquired 100 neighborhood theaters, part of the Moss Shapiro chain in New York, then acquired 200 more theaters in January 1929. By the end of 1928, the value of the Fox Film Corporation was 4 times what it had been 4 years earlier. In fact, William Fox was so successful at this time that in 1929, he had the second highest life insurance policy in the world at $6.4 million. With Fox's success, it got a lot more stars like Madge Bellamy, Lois Moran, Edmund Lowe, Earl Fox, Victor McLaughlin, Mary Astor, Stephen Fetchit, Charles Morton, and Paul Muni, as well as the directors Irving Cummings, Alan Dwan, Howard Hawks, and Raoul Walsh. Perhaps its biggest releases in this movie-tone period were a string of Janet Gaynor Charles Farrell movies, Seventh Heaven in 1927, Street Angel in 1928, and Lucky Star in 1929. Fox was also famous for its newsreels, which it began releasing in 1919 under the name Fox News. The silent newsreels continued until 1930, by which time Fox Movietone newsreels had completely overtaken them. Its first sound newsreel premiered at the Roxy Theater on April 30th, 1927, showing West Point cadets doing drills. Soon after that, Fox also released sound footage of Charles Lindbergh taking off for his famous transatlantic flight. The official Movietone newsreel series began in 1928, still pretty early on in the talkie revolution, and brought sound to the big news stories of the day, and were played before feature films. The sound newsreels were very popular, and Fox basically had a monopoly on them for the time being because its biggest competitor for newsreels, Pathé, hadn't started making their own yet. In addition to buying up movie theaters, William Fox also started buying other studios. In 1928, he bought a minority interest in First National Pictures. But a much bolder move was when he tried to get control of MGM in a secret deal with Nicholas Skank, the president of Lowe's, MGM's parent company. There were rumors about it in the trade magazines for a long time, with Skank repeatedly denying that there was any deal. But it soon became confirmed, and William Fox very nearly became the most powerful person in the movie industry. But then there was a problem. While Fox had initially got the deal cleared with the US government, the new Attorney General in the Hoover administration shot it down. Louis B. Mayer of MGM, who had been upset about the deal, had decided to use his political connections to nix it on the grounds that it was too monopolistic. Of course, he didn't do this as a principled stand to uphold the law, but because it threatened his own power in the company and the industry. Fox was still on his way to the top, but this too would soon come crashing down. In July 1929, Fox's regular chauffeur got his brother to cover his duties, but he wasn't used to the road going to the Lakeview Country Club where Fox was going. He got into a nasty accident that killed him and seriously injured Fox and his friend, who were both ejected from the vehicle. To make matters worse, Fox lost a ton of money when the stock market crashed in October 1929, and he had to sell his shares in First National to Warner Brothers shortly afterward. And unbeknownst to William Fox, he wouldn't be in charge of his own company for much longer. His fall was truly one of the hardest in the 1920s movie industry. Normally, in a list of major Hollywood studios, RKO Pictures would get a bigger spotlight, but because its first movie was only released in March 1929, its 1920s production history is pretty short. But how it came to be is pretty interesting. The initials for RKO stood for Radio Keith Orpheum, and here's why it was named that. And just a warning, there's gonna be a lot of acronyms in this section. First off, we have to go back to an older studio, Robertson Cole, also known as RC. It reorganized in 1922, and its name changed to the very corporate-sounding Film Booking Offices of America, or FBO for short, though it still released movies under the RC name. Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of future President John F. Kennedy, was involved with RC/FBO. Thinking that his financial experience could earn him a lot of money in the movie business, he got on the board of directors in 1921 and resigned 2 years later. But that didn't mean he was done with the company. In 1926, Kennedy bought FBO from the British banking interests that owned it for $1 million. This was a pretty low figure because FBO was making low-budget movies, when bigger movie studios were starting to get even bigger and turning out slicker and more expensive movies. Kennedy saved money and streamlined the studio to become more profitable, and really turned it around, much to the amazement of industry people. At this time, FBO specialized in B-movies, especially westerns, and some of its bigger names were Fred Thompson, Bob Custer, Tom Tyler, Yakima Canutt, and Ranger the Dog. It's because of the low budget and rather ephemeral nature of FBO's movies that the vast majority of them are lost. This is a problem for all the B-movie studios' catalogs of this period. In January 1928, the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, General Electric, and Westinghouse bought significant shares in FBO. RCA had its own sound-on-film process called Photophone to compete with Warner Brothers and Fox, but was in a quandary. Many theaters' wiring for sound had a contract with Western Electric for their sound equipment, and it was already very expensive. And RCA needed a way to get its foot in the door at the immense opportunity going on. Well, the Keith Albee circuit of vaudeville and movie theaters had merged with the Orpheum circuit to form Keith Albee Orpheum. KAO then merged with FBO, giving it away into exhibition. So the mergers had combined a production and distribution company with a company that had made its own sound process and a chain of theaters to exhibit movies. And with that, RKO was officially created on October 23, 1928. Then FBO was fully absorbed into RKO on January 25, 1929. So, to summarize, RC became FBO, and FBO merged with KAO and RC to become RKO. Are you still with me? Okay, good. Joseph Kennedy resigned from the company shortly after all of this. David Sarnoff of RCA didn't trust Kennedy anyway because Kennedy was purely in it for the money, while Sarnoff was looking to innovate. Sarnoff wanted to make much higher quality movies than FBO had put out, ones that could compete with the big studios. In 1929, the musical trend in Hollywood was in full swing, and RKO wisely jumped on that lucrative bandwagon, releasing Syncopation in March 1929, the studio's first release, and Street Girl a few months later. But its greatest success came in September, with the very profitable musical Rio Rita, which was one of the top-grossing movies of 1929. It had another pretty profitable movie, The Vagabond Lover, which is mostly known for featuring Rudy Vallee, who had become a national sensation that year. RKO released non-musicals as well that year, but none were nearly as popular as their big musicals. Of course, RKO would go on to make a number of movies that many people even today would know or at least have heard of, but that's outside the bounds of this channel. For a studio of its modest size and stature in 1920s Hollywood, the Hal Roach Studios produced a lot of big names, like Harold Lloyd, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, Charlie Chase, Snub Pollard, and of course, the Our Gang Kids. The main guy behind the studio was, of course, producer Hal Roach. In 1920, his studio was named the Roland Film Company, and had just started using its new studio in Culver City in February. In August, its name was officially changed to the Hal E. Roach Studios. The big success story at this time was Harold Lloyd. Lloyd and Roach had been making movies together for years by that point, and Lloyd's career was really starting to take off. He had recovered from a potentially career or life-ending injury from a prop bomb explosion in 1919, but he was back on track. He had upgraded to 2 reel shorts and had unveiled his new glasses character. His shorts quickly went up to 3 reels. Then in 1921, he and Roach accidentally made Lloyd's first feature film, A Sailor-Made Man. It started out as a short, but there was so much good footage that they released it as a feature, and it was quite successful. Lloyd went on to make 4 more features with the Roach Studio in 1922 and 1923, with Grandma's Boy, Dr. Jack, Safety Last, and Why Worry, all of them pretty popular with audiences. Lloyd gradually got more autonomy over his movies, and Roach became less involved. In fact, Roach was less involved in directing in general, having to attend to more business matters. In 1923, Lloyd parted ways with Roach to make his own independent production company. The Roach Studio continued specializing in 1 and 2 reel comedy shorts, with its main series after Lloyd went into features being Snub Pollard, who had worked extensively with Lloyd previously. 1922 saw the start of the Our Gang series, which featured a cast of kids getting into all kinds of shenanigans. The series was originally called Hal Roach's Rascals, but the name of the first short, Our Gang, was then applied to the whole series. The story goes that Hal Roach saw a group of kids playing outside one day and thought that their interactions and dynamics were naturally funny, funnier than kids who were trained to be actors. And children were starting to be seen as having star potential, with the recent successes of Jackie Coogan in The Kid, Baby Peggy's series of shorts, and the cast of Kids in Penrod. Roach was confident that his idea of having a looser series with a lot of relatively unknown kids would be more appealing to audiences, because it felt more authentic and natural, as opposed to a bunch of kids overacting. Roach had pushed his distributor, Pathé, to start a series with future Our Gang member Ernie Morrison, aka Sunshine Sammy, but Pathé said there wasn't a big market for kid pictures. With the runaway success of Our Gang shortly afterward, Roach's instinct was proven right. Though it should be noted that a lot of the legwork for the actual making of the shorts was done by director Robert McGowan. The early members of Our Gang became pretty famous, including the aforementioned Ernie Morrison, as well as Alan Hoskins, Mickey Daniels, Jackie Condon, Peggy Ahern, Joe Cobb, Jean Darling, Bobby Hutchins, and Marianne Jackson, among others. Before the end of the decade, Pete the Pup would make his appearance as well, just in time for the start of talkie production for the series in 1929. Meanwhile, Snub Pollard got promoted from 1-reelers to 2-reelers, but his 2-reelers weren't well received, so he went back to the lower prestige 1-reelers. Will Rogers and Stan Laurel also did some shorts at Roach Studios, but they didn't really work out that well either. But another man who had been working for Roach for a while named Charles Parrott became a big hit for the studio. You may better know him by his stage name, Charlie Chase. He started his series of shorts in late 1923 and would be promoted to 2-reelers in 1925. Around 1926, the Roach Studio abandoned 1-reelers because, as I mentioned before, they were considered very low-prestige productions. Instead, it would focus on better-produced 2-reelers, with one way of describing this as shorts with a feature polish. Roach also experimented with making non-comedy feature films, most notably some Rex the Wonder Horse movies. The King of Wild Horses in 1924, Black Cyclone in 1925, The Devil Horse in 1926, and No Man's Law in 1927. While these were pretty successful, Roach still continued to focus on comedy shorts. Other than Harold Lloyd and Our Gang, Hal Roach Studios is most famous for pairing up Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, creating one of the most iconic comedy duos of all time. They had both appeared in many shorts separately, and even together in 2 of them, but for whatever reason, they weren't paired up as a real duo until 1927. Both of them had stagnating careers before then, and their teaming up was one of those things that just kind of happened. They had really good chemistry on screen together, and the rest is history. After they became a comedy team, they appeared in dozens of shorts, and by mid-1929, they started doing talkies. Roach Studios wasn't a vertically integrated company, so it still needed to have its movies distributed by someone else so that they could reach theaters. For years, they released through Pathé. But in 1927, Roach switched his distributor from Pathé to MGM. This was a time when the big studios were getting back into shorts after having given them up for more features a while back. Each of them developed agreements with smaller shorts producers like Max Sennett and Al Christie. Hal Roach Studios was a pretty hot item then, so they could pair up with one of the biggest and best studios. With talkies, comedy short production was especially affected. Normally, scripts for them were very short and left a lot of room for improvisation. But since talkie productions had to be planned out practically shot for shot in advance, it was a struggle to adjust, especially with Our Gang. But as you all probably know, that series survived and went on to even greater fame. Laurel and Hardy, on the other hand, didn't have too much difficulty adjusting to talkies, and dialogue was incorporated very well into their physical comedy. So in terms of comedy shorts, Hal Roach Studios proved very influential in the 1920s, especially when considering its small size, and the fact that it wasn't vertically integrated like the big studios. I originally planned to do just 2 parts in this series, but I've decided to extend it to 3 parts because the script just kept getting longer and longer. This 3rd part may have to be delayed a month because there's one studio I really want to include, but nobody has ever written a book about it as far as I can tell, so I'll have to piece things together from other stuff and do a lot more of my own digging. But I'm sure I can come up with something. Well, anyway, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.